Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. I'm joined today by the crew. We got John Wood Jr., April Lawson, and Monica Guzman. Welcome, y'all. Welcome back.
Here we are.
Hey.
So we are gathered today during a pivotal and potentially transformative moment in American history. Not only is America and the world continuing to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, but America has seen widespread mass movement protests over the past 10 days, which were initially spurred by the death of George Floyd in police custody by an officer who kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for several minutes as he said, "I can't breathe." This incident triggered protests, which have since morphed into a mass movement protesting racial injustice, systemic inequality, and police brutality. This issue has become a raw one for many Americans, but we've also seen some heartening moments of unity and emotion and empathy amidst the violence and discord that we've all been confronted with over the past few days. So I'm really happy to have this group gathered today to discuss it, to lend our own personal perspectives, and think about it within the context of the work that we're trying to do, which is to bring people together with vastly divergent viewpoints and lean head-on into emotionally tumultuous issues that speak to our core identities and how we perceive ourselves in relation to others and in relation to this community we call America. So before we dive into some of the issues of the past week, including the emerging movement to quote unquote defund the police, or at least rethink how we fund law enforcement in the context of funding for social programs and how we envision the relationship between communities and police and the prioritization of our resources across law enforcement, healthcare, education. Before we talk about that, and before we talk as well about a larger issue of free speech versus social justice, who deserves a platform in this moment, and how we can talk about it, issues that have come to the fore this past weekend with the New York Times publishing of Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed, which called for a massive display of military force to quell the protests, subsequent backlash at the New York Times, which led ultimately to the opinion editor stepping down. Before we get into all of that, issues which I think will be of immense interest to our listeners, I just wanted to go around the room first and see how you guys have been processing everything that's been going on. Last week was intensely emotional, and it can be sometimes hard to disentangle our personal reactions from our professional evaluations. And so, April, why don't I start with you? You're in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Your boyfriend is an auxiliary police officer. You have seen the images firsthand of the protests and President Trump. What has your thought process been like? What feelings have come to the forefront for you?
Oh, man. I think this is, very intense for everyone, and most of all for African Americans. And so I want to recognize that. It's also the case that when you live with a police officer, and Dan actually is both a reserve police officer and works for MPD. And prior to this worked for the budget office, including on the police budget. So lots of thoughts there. But in the last week, there have been primarily three. One is, I think a lot of folks have been able to be like, gosh, current events are terrible, but then they put it down and have dinner. And in my household, it has instead been, Dan gets up to the minute alerts every time something violent happens in DC or there's a warning. And so for the last week, it's been, there's looting around Farragut Square. Oh, there's protesters threw a backpack full of kerosene at officers. It didn't explode, thank God, because they would have died. There's somebody like a white man in a bulletproof vest. That probably means he's armed and is planning something. Oh my God. And so like, it's been very hard to relax. And there's been just an ever-present sense of violence and fear related to that. And Dan's team has been working overnight. So he has, one night he biked home at 12:30 in the middle of the protests, and like, that was terrifying. But I knew that in order to go get his car, I would have to go outside because there were no Ubers, because there was a curfew. And anyway, it just, he got home safe and sound, but it's just scary. And it's, I know, not just scary for our side, but it's scary for everybody. And the other big thing I've been feeling is futility. And I have a background in trauma, and one of the things that is consistently characterizes traumatic events, both for survivors and witnesses, is just a sense of futility. And I think many, many people all over the country want to do something. And the truth is, there's just, on a certain level, there are things we can do, but on another level, this is too big for any of us to fix alone, especially right now. And so futility. And I think that it's just been a mess. The last thing I would say is just, I've been trying to observe this, because we also, we went to a prayer vigil for this. Mayor Bowser ordered that Black Lives Matter be painted on 16th Street leading right up to the White House. I think that in DC, a lot of cops would be marching with the protesters, except that we're in DC. And so instead, they have to protect the White House. And that's a challenging position for some of them, given what they think of the president. And the what seems to be happening is that there are deep feelings of dehumanization on both sides. And it's a tragedy, because what police mostly do is take care of people. We can talk more about this later, and yet suddenly we have two very important groups of people in society that are at odds when everybody ultimately wants both public safety and racial justice. So it's a mess, and it's sad and scary.
Monica, you are in Seattle on the West Coast, holding it down as per usual. What have the last week, 2 weeks been like for you?
Yeah, ahead of this podcast, I was thinking about how hard it has been to articulate very much. I think that's because there's a strong sense of ground shifting beneath our feet, and my feet as well. The way the world is, we've been under a period of lots of change and turmoil for a while. And just when you think it's gotten about as fast as it can get, it gets faster. So the word acceleration comes up for me, where it really is just happening all very, very fast. And it's difficult for me to get a grip on pieces of it. To give a sense of some of what the last couple weeks have looked like for me, there have been intense conversations with all of the following. My parents, who are deeply conservative and have, points of view on all of these things that, if said out loud in many parts of Seattle, would not a friendly reception get. Conversations with friends of mine who have been in the anti-racist world for a long time, and where they're at. And then with my 7-year-old and 5-year-old kids, my thinking that I've talked with them about race a little bit, and so they must know a little bit. And I brought up the conversation and realized how little they knew. I watched Facebook for a while, but I've never spent so much time watching Facebook without saying much myself. I became very fascinated by the negotiations people are making right now, because there's something about you speak when you know the ground you stand on, and you have kind of a sense, to your point, Ciaran, you opened this podcast by talking about our relationship to the world, our relationship to each other. I think that's part of what is shifting and changing so quickly that it's hard to keep up with. But I saw, for example, this 40,000 person Facebook group, Pacific Northwest Outdoor Women. And all this starts going down, and people start posting about Black Lives Matter. And other people say, hey, this is about the outdoors. And then, as you can imagine, it just becomes this enormous, it's like we have digital streets too, and there are protests there too, right? There's sort of this occupation of this new frame of thinking that is so powerful and has so much momentum that, to April's point about you see the headlines, you sit down to dinner. I don't know. That's becoming real hard, right? And to see people talk about their own race more, as a white woman, as a Black man, as a so-and-so, like we're all trying to position ourselves now with much more consciousness about who we are racially, and expressing and trying to articulate those relationships as they are and as they are changing. So, maybe the most hopeful thing that I think of from all of this is, wow, I've been alive 37 years. And today, like right now, is where I'm feeling like this is how culture change happens. It is, as April said, a mess. It's a mess. Like history looks back at moments like 1968 and other areas. Like, yes, it's messy, but we have this nobility around the outcome. And I'm trying to remind myself of that while there is a sense of futility and acceleration, and for me, like unsettledness, like I don't even know what to say sometimes and what to do, that this is how culture change happens, isn't it? This is how things move along a spectrum. But man, do I have a lot of questions still. Do I have a lot of critiques? And I'm not really sure where those questions are and are not welcome.
And John, you have thought and written about race many times. You are a Black man who ran for Congress as a Republican. Your father is a white Trump supporter. Your mother is a Black Democrat from South Central Los Angeles. How have you been navigating the past week?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say that in the past week, I've had the most, I think the densest series of intense conversations and emotional interactions with the widest range of people, including people who are close to me and people who I respect, that I can ever recall having at any time. And it's striking to me how it seems as if every conversation I have with people at this moment is sort of loaded up with the sense that the stakes are high, if not for the country in each individual case, that at least for the status of perhaps, my own rapport or relationship with various people. And I, it's a familiar phenomenon to me to watch the American people and just people I'm in a position to observe in the long-standing context of our extreme political polarization, feel as if they are being pushed to take a side and to either give in to taking one side or the other, or to struggle to hold on to some core element of themselves that can sort of rise above the tribal choosing. Those forces are greatly accelerated in this moment. And in this moment, I have seen what I think have been true and honest and sort of inspiring changes of heart from unlikely quarters for people who are folks on one side of this cultural collide who are listening with more earnestness and open ears to folks on the other side of it. then I see a lot of folks who are remaining silent or signaling certain noises from a place of what I think is actually just real tremulous fear. I think that there are people, many of us, who feel that this is a moment in which a person is either going to be stampeded or is going to join the herd, depending on where you find yourself in things. And then, of course, there are those folks who are holding fast to their, I was going to say holding fast to their guns, but I meant it metaphorically, but bad metaphor at the moment. There are folks who are holding fast to their positions and, to stand up against the cultural mainstream, folks who don't want to have a certain media and social narrative pushed down their throats, and they're striving to hold that hill. And where I find myself is where I have always found myself, which is saying that ultimately, for one, people tend not to feel passionately about a moral or social cause if it does not reflect something that is true in our reality. Therefore, we have an obligation to listen to everybody and to set the context, set the stage for the American people to be heard. And so I say that with a certain special sensitivity as an African American, but that principle remains true for everyone. And then, secondarily, I think the thing that allows me to function somewhat as well as I'm able to in this moment lies in the fact that Ciaran, Monica, April, and in the work that we do at Braver Angels, it really isn't just it's really not about reacting to the situation. It is about seeking to lay out a path forward in terms of how the American people can listen to each other, challenge each other, fight each other, but fight in the right way, in a way that strengthens who we are to each other, in a way that bolsters, ultimately, our connections as fellow Americans and fellow human beings, as opposed to letting all of our relationships rip apart in the vicious currents of social change and social fear, right? And so, on the one hand, I'm heartened by this moment because I do think that, particularly with respect to the African American community, there is this upswelling of genuine of the pain of real experience that for so long I think most Americans have been largely deaf to, and not necessarily signaling the fact that most Americans mean ill with respect to the Black community. It's just that folks don't know what they don't know. But my hope is that this moment in which America is listening to the cries of the Black community in a way that I think is beyond what we've experienced in the recent past, my hope is that this isn't a moment that gives way to the pretense of easy solutions and the opportunity for the ripping of social bonds in a spirit of bitterness. My hope is that the passion of this moment gives way to the flowering of a renaissance in the way in which we choose to engage each other that can allow for the full voicing of everybody's American experience in a way that uplifts everybody's dignity. Again, with a special focus on folks who have suffered, but recognizing the fact that suffering is a part of human life and American life. And within that, we have a special obligation to be sensitive to those among us who are suffering the most. But to do that, it requires nuance and thoughtfulness, genuine empathy, the type of which we look at Braver Angels as being the truest evidence of patriotism. And so committing to that future, to that America, the America of the beloved community, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, that's what sustains me in this, because it alleviates my own feelings of powerlessness or helplessness. And it makes me think that, in this organization and beyond, we can do the things that really need to be done.
Well, thank you all for that. I think all of what you guys said resonated with me. I've certainly felt a sense of futility, and I've felt the acceleration, but I've also been filled with a sense of empowerment and a sense of hope and a sense of awakening. I live in New York City. I went to a couple protests last week. The first one, I saw NYPD officers taking a knee with protesters and engaging in dialogue and conversation and seemingly even mutual affection. And then I attended another protest 2 days later in violation of curfew, and I witnessed some, to my mind, pretty heinous acts of police brutality. And both these things are true. I think that it's time for us to come together if we can when these forces are pulling us apart. I think these sources of pain and anguish and anger have been rippling in our society beneath the surface in some ways for centuries, decades, for the past few years. So I don't see this necessarily as some kind of sudden outburst. I see this as a boiling point, and I see this as a venue for people to make their voices heard and to inject into mainstream America, into corporate America, the reality that so many people have experienced for so long and have been crying out largely to deaf ears, John. And so I think what we might be seeing in this country is a reckoning of sorts. People can no longer look away. You cannot go on social media without being forced to engage this issue. You can barely sit down to dinner. So the question then becomes, where do we go from here? The summer has just begun. People are out and about. Part of what felt so empowering about the protests for me is that people in New York City had been under lockdown for the 10 or so weeks preceding the protests. And there was just such a palpable hunger within people for connection, for solidarity, for being outside and being close to people. It was almost intoxicating, marching down the street, being close to people, yelling in unison, voicing both positive exaltations of community and shared goals and real pain and anger. But people were, you could just feel it, that people wanted to be together. So there is that energy, and it's all tied up with this tribalism. You know, where does the tribe end? Where does the tribe begin? The ultimate tribe, of course, is that of human beings. And I think, as you mentioned, part of the human condition is a natural aversion to feelings of pain and discomfort that can lead to self-doubt and self-judgment and self-reproach that is then projected onto other people. And what we try to do at Braver Angels is to courageously sit with and face these feelings and ultimately try to transcend them. And it is my hope that we can do this as an organization, as a community, as a country. And I'm feeling energized, but I also needed this weekend to unplug because I was going a little bit crazy. Mm-hmm. So I think moving forward, it seems that some of the demands of the protests have begun to cohere in some ways. I think for a long time, you know, abolish the police was regarded as kind of a fringe element among certain activists. I mean, I remember when Black Lives Matter first came out, it was largely painted in the mainstream media as this kind of radical movement, maximalist rhetoric, reactionary. Now you have Black Lives Matter painted on the block leading up to the White House. You have Mitt Romney tweeting Black Lives Matter. The acceleration of views that were previously considered radical have become mainstream so quickly. And I've noticed that abolish the police has now iterated to defund the police. And within the defund the police debate, there are all sorts of gradations and nuances. some people are literally saying, eliminate the police force, invest all that money in other things. Maybe we don't do it immediately, but the end goal is really to eliminate state agents as a force for enforcement of laws that people view as subjugation. Then you have other people who really want to take another look at our funding priorities and say, why is the New York City spending $6 billion on police every year, but a tiny percentage of that on education and healthcare? Why are we seeing so many incidents of police brutality at protests that are protesting police brutality, thereby in some ways self-evidently making the case that the problem is real and does exist? So there are many ways to look at this. There's a fear, of course, that defund the police will just become another line in the sand. You're either for or against it. All nuance is lost. It leads more to maximalist rhetoric because people feel that's the only way to get any attention. The Democrats just unveiled a sweeping bill proposing all sorts of changes in funding law enforcement. The city of Minneapolis just announced they are going to disband the police force. What does that mean? It remains to be seen. We will be hopefully putting together a discussion soon between members of the Minneapolis police force and African-American leaders in the community. But I wanted to turn it all over to you. How are you guys thinking about this issue tangibly? Because as I mentioned, this issue can no longer be punted. We are going to have a revisiting and a reshaping of law enforcement in this country, at least to the extent that this continues to be the pressing issue at the forefront of so many people's minds. So, April, I guess I want to start with you. As you mentioned, you have sort of firsthand window into what it's like to be a police officer, what it's like to be entrusted with the responsibility of protecting and serving your community, but also existing within a system that many people would argue protects officers who have done wrong at the expense of victims, primarily African Americans. So how do you see this issue, and how do you think about potential systemic change that could benefit both police officers and the community, rather than this kind of zero-sum game, this defined pie in which we take from law enforcement and give to the community, or we take from the community and give to law enforcement?
Thank you, Ciaran. I'm so glad you called on me. I was wondering if it's because I was making faces while you were talking about defund the police. I will not ask you if that was actually the reason, but I have to admit that there's a degree to which this drives me absolutely crazy, because the idea that so I admit there are gradations in defund the police, and I am interested in, and it's a good negotiation tactic, right? If you want something that's at the 50% mark, to make your 100% case first. I understand that, but it feels like hyperbole. It feels like a battle cry. It feels like, it's a phrase that is intentionally provocative, that seems disrespectful. Now, it comes from a community who justifiably does not respect the police, but the problem is that it's just, I will just say this. So yes, if we're talking about a 20% cut to police budgets, then reallocating that money to social services or education or whatever, that's a reasonable argument. We could talk about that. Personally, I don't think that's the answer, but I do think that's a reasonable position. The problem that I see is that when people talk about, the thing is, though, that I'm sorry, this is driving me so crazy that I'm having trouble getting sentences out. I just, when Dan and I went to a budget engagement forum, the DC mayor runs budget engagement forums where local people can come and comment on the draft budget. And there was a group of activists there last year, or the year before, I don't remember, and they said, well, we want to defund the police. And Dan asked them literally, like, well, what do you think the police budget should be? And they said $0. And so that is really a position that's out there. And the problem is that, like, that suggests both a misunderstanding of human beings and of what police actually do. Because you might as well try to or try to abolish crime, right? Or abolish sin. So Dan has crime briefings every Monday and Thursday, and they go through all the major crimes of the last 3 days. And you hear a litany, and people can look these up, right? There's this homicide, there's that homicide, there's this rape, there's that sexual assault, there's this robbery, there's this burglary. And the idea that we can have community peacekeepers that are going to prevent all that stuff without doing without having any recourse to violence is crazy. And and I want to say also on that subject, and then I'll get to what police actually do. With regard to community peacekeepers, what would happen if we actually shifted power away from state agents towards, say, cultural agents, which is what community peacekeepers would be, is that all that you do is that you transfer a monopoly on force to somebody else. And I would prefer that the people who maintain order in our society, and yes, that unfortunately does redound to force on some level, are heavily regulated by law and by a whole system that at least aims for everybody to be equal under the law. If we had just like people that communities had decided were going to be the peacekeepers who got to have the guns, what would happen is that those people would become little oligarchies, right? Like all of a sudden they would get to regulate what was and was not appropriate, who got off, who was convicted. And so I just think that it's a question of who do you want to invest with power, and people, human beings, are bad with power. It's not just the state. It's actually a human problem. There's a siren outside my house. Sorry. I don't think it's protest related because it's too early. Anyway, so I think that the problem is that human beings are it's just hard to design a corruption-proof system. Now, is there institutional racism? Yes. Does it exist in police forces? Yes. Is major reform needed to address that? Absolutely. But I don't think that the cries to abolish the police are helping with that at all, because what they do is they cause police forces to close ranks. And the last thing I want to say is just that what police actually do most of the time is like, so when Dan comes home after a shift, what it will be is, I checked up on somebody who said that those kids were in the park too late. DC has a lot of domestic violence calls, particularly right now with the pandemic. So you go and try to see if there's something you can do, although most domestic violence calls don't result in action. A DC police officer will, every single shift, will help somebody who's involved in some kind of mental health episode. Maybe they're in the middle of the street and they're high or they're having a mental health problem. You move them to safety. Maybe they have had an overdose and are lying on the sidewalk. And police officers in my neighborhood know the names of most of the people who are lying on the sidewalk most of the time, because it's so common. And there's a real problem with mental health and with addiction here. And one of the worst days, Dan came home and said, I tried to staunch the bleeding of a man who'd been shot. And he was really troubled by it. And some of the older police officers were like, nope, this happens all the time. It's just another one. And that's a terrible feeling, right? You don't want to become jaded, but it's when police encounter traumatic content all the time, and it's almost always in a context where they're trying to save a life or respond to somebody else's cry for help. And that's their day-to-day. And so to say that, like, they are, I feel like in a lot of people's minds, they are boogeymen who wander around looking for people to abuse in some fashion. And are there bad cops? Absolutely. But with regard to constructive thinking, Ciaran, since you did ask for that as well, I think that one of the big problems is that the difference, so my dad went to Poland as part of the team from the US after the Berlin Wall fell that helped to help those countries become more Western. And what he said is that they wanted to know, how do you make a police force? And that the fundamental difference between a military and a police force is that police have a responsibility to the civil rights of the people that are the aggressors, whereas military doesn't, right? So that's a very important distinction. But I would actually go further. I think our police are not much like the military at all. What they are a lot like, at least in DC, is EMTs, or people who intervene in small conflicts, or who try to just help where they're asked. And the problem is that police training has a lot to do with law and order and not much at all to do with mental health. And so I think that if police training were reformed to better suit what police actually do, which is mostly respond to people in crisis, that would be good for everyone. And more funding for that, for the police department, for social services, all of that sounds good to me.
Thank you for that perspective. That makes me think of my own experience in New York City. I think that at least, in the neighborhoods I've lived in, the vast majority of arrests and citations, were issued not for violent crimes, but for crimes like loitering, for crimes like low-level drug offenses, primarily concentrated in Black and Brown communities, which of course then often can...
History and reason. There are some issues in New York in particular with that, I think. Yeah, go on.
Can then introduce those people into the system, quote unquote. And anyway, that's just something I've noticed in New York. And I think I can understand why a lot of communities would want to reject the system whole cloth as something that does not work for them. But your point is well taken, that I think a lot of times the quote unquote solution is not as well developed as, pointing out all the problems, which I think is also human nature. John, why don't I turn things over to you, and then I'll go to Monica. What's sort of your perspective about this, having grown up in Los Angeles, having, lived in South LA, having been a part of a community that is very reliant on the police, but has also been abused by the police?
Right. I think it's worth remarking on the sort of the context, the informational context in which let's just say, left and right are sort of receiving this phrase, defund the police, right now. Ciaran, of course, you made the point that there's a way in which some of the overreaction from law enforcement and some of the protests seems to make the argument for, the protesters in terms of the need to disempower, I suppose, some of these departments, or maybe police departments in general. On the other hand, I think for a lot of folks on the other side of the issue who are looking at just unprecedented, nearly unprecedented anyway, civil unrest seems to make the argument just as self-evidently going the other way. This is a moment in which many people are very grateful for law enforcement, even if they abhor what happened to George Floyd, because they still feel that, society is just sort of running out of control at the moment. And obviously we see President Trump seeking to sort of echo those sentiments, tweeting out in all caps, law and order, and so forth, saying, I'm your president of law and order. So there's a very natural constituency for that. And one doesn't have a tough time understanding why when one turns on the TV and sees chaos in the streets on the news, or maybe you just look out your own window. But there's a statistical angle to this too, because not only are people, many Reds, I think in particular, feeling this way, but they're feeling this way against the backdrop of, data that shows or seems to show, including information pulled from curated by the Washington Post, that suggests that I think in the year 2019, or maybe it was 2018, I don't recall, but that you had something along the lines of 19 officer killings by police officers of white people, and 9, I'm sorry, I'm getting the numbers reversed, it was either 9 or 19 white people killed by police officers in a given year, and either 9 or 19 African Americans killed by police officers in a given year. And whatever the actual number is on either side of it, it is one, so vanishingly small, and two, so close to being equal, that even if it is disproportionate in the direction of African Americans, you still have a lot of conservatives and other Americans who look at that data and say, well, goodness gracious, regardless of how terrible the killing of George Floyd was, what on earth are we tearing the country apart over for this? And then on top of that, suggesting that we need to defund, the one institution in America that is supposed to prevent, generally speaking, obviously, violence and chaos of the sort that we are seeing now, all the way down to just our day-to-day security concerns. Now, on the other side of that, you've got a lot of folks in the Black community in particular, but more broadly speaking, who will point to what it is you just referenced, Ciaran, which is the fact that, okay, deaths at the hands of police officers is one thing, but then you have this larger seeming culture of harassment, which, certainly has expressed itself in Black communities, where over-policing winds up being the thing that sort of defines much of the day-to-day tempo of, particularly Black life in America, where you have people arrested for possessing small amounts of marijuana, for just hanging out fully within your legal rights in a certain area, but because you appear suspicious in a way that correlates with your skin color, officers come and harass you. Or you have instances in which police officers will arrest you for some small infraction or some small offense in hopes of gaining information on somebody else. And if they know that you have a relationship to somebody else who is suspected of committing a certain crime or in a certain case, that tends to be sort of a business as usual way of conducting business. And you can read about this phenomenon in detail in books like Ghetto Side, for instance, which is a history of policing in South Los Angeles, which is, like you said, where I live, Ciaran. And so something I know a bit about. But the deep irony here is that in that book, and many other people would make this argument as well, one of the great tragedies of the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community is not merely these deaths that we see, along the lines of George Floyd and so many others that have been seared in our minds, not just the over-policing of minor offenses, but the under-policing of actual significant offenses, the under-policing of murder, for instance. In inner-city Los Angeles, at least going back several years, you had rates of successful investigations of murder that dwindled down to, well below 40% or so, which in comparison to the success rate of such investigations in neighboring white communities, is far beneath that. And, what in this book and others one learns about is the fact that, in large part because relationships between the police and the community have deteriorated so far, and also because of the under-resourcing of police officers who are actually policing in the most challenging environments, you have situations in which police officers and detectives are A, not motivated, or B, are motivated but not supported enough to actually sufficiently protect and serve the people with whom they are charged to protect and serve, because the circumstances are not there for them to actually do that. And so that becomes a betrayal of the community as well, the underserving, the under-policing of communities that actually need protection. So now it's a remarkable thing, because all of that information, the way that the right is seeing this situation, the way that the left is seeing this situation, what the actual reality is in between these two points of view, this requires a genuinely sort of good faith and nuanced engagement in the reality of the situation we're in. The phrase defund the police, if you just take it on paper, it can introduce, I think, a thoughtful conversation. But the way we're putting it forward at the zenith of our emotion and our fury right now does, to April's point, make it come across, I think, as a threat. And yet there is so much, I think, so many worthy points to be made in support of the idea of increasing the role for community policing, for finding a way to more fully integrate restorative justice into our approach to law enforcement. There are creative conversations that can be had about how we can improve the climate and the reality of law enforcement in America. But because we're following the same old pattern of our politics, only more so in this moment, we're blowing past all of the nuance and using slogans as a means to punish each other in our tribal politics. And for me, without presupposing whether the answers need to go a little left or a little right or what have you, that tendency of how we communicate is precisely what we need to hold the line against in our work, while maintaining our capacity to extend dignity and understanding to folks on different sides of this issue, because everybody has something of a point, but we're just not getting there with any moral clarity because we're so zealous in our hatred at this moment of one another, or at least what we think of one another as standing for. And that's precisely the trend that we need to operate against.
Monica, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, can't agree more with John on a lot of what he said, particularly John. The sloganization makes me think of the certainty. The meme, as an item of our reality is such a fascinating thing because it does take a lot of ideas and it flattens them, right, to a piece of visual and intellectual. It's like a unit that can travel. It can travel far, and it can travel far very quickly. And it travels in a space, our digital spaces, that right now the context of those spaces, unfortunately, is a lot about people picking up the signals of what they're supposed to believe based on how they identify, what side they're on. Memes become their sort of checkboxes. I'm supposed to believe this and this and this and this and this. If I am a liberal, I'm supposed to be this and this and this and this. If I am, a further left kind of progressive liberal, and this if I'm moderate, and this if I'm on the right, and yeah, I mean that is the thing that just kills me, because like you, I see not only nuance but creativity in engaging in this. Coming from the tech side, because I've worked at startups and I've started my own thing, whatever, there's this lovely acronym we use called HMW, how might we? So that instead of just saying we need to defund the police, you say, how might we have an institution in society that offers the right kind of protection for all communities, in such a way that we can live our lives feeling safe and secure. Whatever you want to do. That statement is what I want to find together. I want to find what that statement ought to be. And I want to pose that statement. Because it's what it does is it calls people in to creative problem solving instead of calling them out for not agreeing to a slogan that they're supposed to agree with. So that's one thing I think of. Another is I get very interested in language, as language is sort of a place where you can see culture shift kind of invisibly. But not that long ago, we were talking about racism. Today, we're talking about systemic racism, right? And when I think about the evolution between racism and systemic racism, what I think I see, and I might be wrong, I'm thinking out loud here, but I think part of what I see is one of those supposed differences between the liberal and conservative sort of mindset, which is that liberals often lean towards seeing systems in place. And when there's troubles and problems, liberals tend to see the systems. Conservatives often want to look at individual responsibility, and what people are doing. So when, someone I know says, there is no racism because I'm not racist and I don't know any racists, right? Systemic racism says, look, racism still exists, even though you're pretty sure that not that many people actually have in their hearts this hatred. That doesn't matter. It's not just individual. So systemic racism seems to be kind of holding space for this idea that it's a system. Let's shove aside whatever we think about individuals and just focus on the systemic part. And so then I see, to the extent that frame has become mainstream, well, the answer to a systemic problem is a systemic solution, and something like defund the police becomes a lot more likely. If the whole system is to blame, if racism is because of something systemic and widespread, then take a look at one of the systems and just uproot the whole tree, roots and all, take it out, and start over, and I can kind of understand why from a liberal perspective and systemic thinking, that feels like it makes a lot of sense. But again, coming back to the slogans, the flattening, the lack of nuance, I'm one of those people who thinks like conservative liberal is a yin and yang. You need to hear both things. I don't think it's an accident that for so long our politics has so neatly divided into these two sides. It's because they both have something to contribute. They do. It's just we have such a hard time seeing sometimes the contribution of the other side to the equation.
That's right.
But individual responsibility and systemic change, how do they work together instead of either subscribing to one or another slogan?
Those are very powerful thoughts. You mentioned tribal orthodoxies and how people are increasingly aligning themselves with what they feel like they're supposed to believe based on the tribe of which they feel themselves to be a part. And this leads me into the second item on our podcast agenda, so to speak. This past week, the New York Times published an opinion editorial authored by Senator Cotton of Arkansas, who has been one of the staunchest allies of President Trump, especially when it comes to foreign affairs and the military, and taking up a hard line, a quote unquote law and order line, as people might understand it. He published an op-ed in the Times essentially calling on President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act and not just, send in the police, not just send in the National Guard, but send in the military onto domestic soil, in a quote unquote overwhelming display of military force to quell the protests, which he painted as essentially riots, as essentially looting, as essentially a threat to America. And his argument was that the only way to discourage this behavior was to send in the military. As a result of this op-ed being published, there was a quick and deep uproar among staff members at the New York Times, particularly staff members of color. There was a coordinated campaign on Twitter in which Black employees of the New York Times began tweeting, Senator Cotton's op-ed puts Black New York Times staffers' lives in danger. The movement started to pick up steam. People said, why was this op-ed published? People pointed to supposed inaccuracies. But more broadly, people said that, Tom Cotton's op-ed crossed a boundary, right? So people say that, in our system of liberal values, there are boundaries, right? I mean, the New York Times would not publish an op-ed calling for the return of slavery, for example, to take, the most extreme position. That slavery is abhorrent is taken as a background assumption, not a subject of legitimate debate. So I guess the question in some ways is, where are the boundaries? And, just as important, who draws them? Who gets to decide what is in bounds and out of bounds? It's often, or is it, the press's job to draw those lines? So I think all these questions are, at the heart of the Cotton affair, so to speak, which ultimately led the opinion editor of the New York Times to step down. One funny aside about that is that the opinion editor repeatedly claimed, I didn't actually read the op-ed, which I don't think especially helped his case among the other staffers who basically argued that the authoritarianism that they see Cotton's op-ed representing as being incompatible with liberal democracy. And because it's the purpose of journalism, some say, to defend liberal democracy, that's the story that the press should tell. So ultimately, the Times, they didn't take down the op-ed, but they sort of issued an editor's note where they said that the process that led to the op-ed was improper, And they essentially backtracked. They essentially caved to the demands of the newsroom. And I think this has really set a precedent in the United States, because the New York Times is often considered the paper of record. And there was also an incident this weekend in which the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer was pressured to step down because the paper published a column about the destruction of property, the headline of which was "Buildings Matter Too," which, obviously struck a lot of people as insensitive. And again, the Black staff members of the Inquirer essentially said, it's our prerogative to protest this. And they created enough pressure that the editor had to step down. If you look at conservative press, a lot of conservatives are pointing to these two incidents to say, look how far this has gone. This is the epitome, the crystallization of the quote-unquote cancel culture, the quote-unquote rejection of viewpoint diversity that's supposedly run amok at college campuses. Is something that Jonathan Haidt has written about in The Coddling of the American Mind. And conservatives often I see arguing that, these young reporters are the products of these elite institutions, and they are now becoming the decision makers who are leading our institutions. So I, for my part, can really see both sides of this argument personally. I think that the press should be predicated on a spirit of free inquiry. And I often think that debates should be out in the open. That's the best way to contest ideas. But I also take the point that there is a line. There are op-eds, I believe, that the Times should not publish. I just mentioned one, calling for a return to chattel slavery. I don't think the Times should publish something like that. Tom Cotton's op-ed, some people say is, fascistic, is calling for the military to be unleashed on citizens. And that is a proto-fascist argument that should not be tolerated in the public square. So with that wordy and verbose John Wood Jr. style introduction, had to take a quick dig. Why don't I turn things over again to April Lawson, who I could see trying to restrain herself from making too many faces. And I just love the passion that you're bringing to this, April. The other thing I should mention is April Lawson worked at the New York Times for many years. She worked for David Brooks, who was a conservative columnist for the Times. I think still probably considers himself a conservative, but would be rejected by many people on the right today. And obviously, as opposed to President Trump, who, John, you mentioned tweeted Law and Order. It should be noted he also tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." So I think it's important to remember Trump's role in all of this and the violent rhetoric that he has espoused that some people then see establishment conservatives as defending or covering up. But before I continue this wordy ramble, why don't I turn things over to you, April? Based on my introduction, based on your background at the Times, how do you come down, I guess, specifically on this op-ed, but more importantly, the broader issue of free speech, social justice, deplatforming, and really the role of journalists to come up and speak out and demand that their editors respond to their own boundaries, so to speak?
Yes, well, thank you. Seems like all my life experiences are relevant at the moment, but so I worked at the Times for about 5 years for David Brooks and Ross Douthat, who were at the time the only two conservative columnists. And as you say, David then and now would be rejected by many on the right as a squish. But I think this is really important. I really agree with you, Ciaran, that this is an inflection point. And I think that it's a huge deal that the paper of record has allowed itself to be chastised in this way by those who, well, this is tricky, right? And I don't want to get into using provocative words. What I would say is that our whole society in some ways is in flux with this question right now. And I actually think that the rising movements on right and left have a lot to do with this. In my view, what has happened overall is that little L liberalism reigned for several decades, but the problem with little L liberalism is that it is morally vacuous. It says we should have a system in which things are fair, and it sort of sets out rules, but it doesn't provide a creed. And with the decline of institutionalized religion and other things, I think that people look for creeds. They need them because we're spiritual beings. And so what's happening is that little L liberalism is slowly being edged out on the left by progressivism, which is a creed, and by the social justice sort of way of thinking. And it's really hard because I consider myself both someone who cares a lot about social justice and someone who is a conservative and believes in free speech, and they are at odds to a degree. But I think that the thing to see is that there is a line, and also that what the progressives have been doing is using that fact as a tactic to force social norms to change faster than they actually can. And so they've been trying to say the line is here, no, it's here, no, it's here, no, it's here. And the problem with that is that it takes apart the speech codes that are necessary for a free society. Senator Tom Cotton is a big deal. He's not only is he a senator, but he's not just any senator. And it grieves me that the paper of record is up in arms about whether it should have published one of the leading voices in the country. Not because I think Cotton is necessarily right or wrong, but because if it's going to be the paper of record and if our society is going to hang together, we have to have a forum where the major voices can be heard. And the fact that the Times is bowing to pressure to back away from that suggests to me that one of our most powerful institutions that has provided that forum for most of American, well, since it was founded, is fading. And in my own time at the Times, I recall that this war was already there. There was a younger generation of journalists who constantly, and this happens now too, had conflicts with the older generation on this exact kind of thing. They wanted to draw the boundaries of what it is acceptable to say in a different place that was not the sort of consensus of America. And they wanted to do it in order to push the consensus of America. But the problem is that that's fundamentally at odds with what journalism is and is for. And I think that our free society depends on institutions, and those institutions have to have, there's a wonderful new book about this by Yuval Levin called A Time to Build on this exact subject that has influenced me greatly and that I also worked on. And it argues that in order for us to have trustworthy institutions, our institutions have to actually follow their principles. That means journalism has to actually aim for objectivity. It has to actually be nonpartisan. And I understand that that will involve accepting some of the quote, unacceptable aspects of the status quo, some of the morally repugnant aspects of the status quo. But I think that the Times and other journalistic institutions absolutely have an obligation to do that because they play a crucial role in allowing our society to think its thoughts and move forward. We have always gambled that free speech is the best way to promote freedom. And I think we've been right thus far. Are we there yet? No. But I think it's the right gamble.
And do you think that there are boundaries?
Oh, of course. I ran into this question when I run debates, right? And I trained a bunch of teachers in Ohio not too long ago. And this was the key question they were asking is, suppose I have a student from an immigrant family in my classroom and the kids want to debate immigration. How do I handle that? Where are the boundaries? And I think that the answer has to be that the boundaries of discourse are governed by society at large rather than small decision makers within institutions. So what I told the teachers is so one of them was like, well, what if my kids want to debate resolve the sky is green? And I said, if half your kids think that, then yeah, you should have that debate because that's the question that's actually on America's mind. And that means that's what has to be talked about if we want to make any progress. And we can dislike where we are, but the answer to that isn't to not talk about it.
Hmm.
Yep.
John, I know you mentioned you might have to jump off soon, so why don't I give you a chance to respond to that, say how you feel on this issue, then we can go to Monica and maybe close this out.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer to live in first of all, I would prefer to live in a country wherein equal justice is something that has truly been realized, right? And that is an ideal to which I think we should all seek to strive. That it's very American to strive for, right? And so I fully recognize the imperative of that. But I think I'd also like to live in a country that has the humility to see that the way you sustain that kind of social progress is by earnestly engaging people with the truth of the moral perspective that informs it, right? And you can't do that unless you allow space for these differences to be aired so that they can be appropriately engaged, so that sentiments can be transformed. There are all sorts of, I think, attempts that folks make to try and skip the conversation, right? Because we see an avenue towards accomplishing a short-term political game that we think is going to get us to where we want to be. But if that's something that happens through the muzzling of, some significant number of the American people, then you're never going to have what Martin Luther King Jr. would have referred to as positive peace. It is a tactic that is outside of the strictures of nonviolence, ultimately, because what nonviolence seeks, in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. Taught it, what nonviolence seeks is the inclusion of even people who you consider to be enemies today into the American family tomorrow, and that inclusive process begins with a conversation over truth. And you can't have a conversation if you end the engagement on the basis of the idea that some points of view are unacceptable. Some points of view are wrong, are morally wrong, and need to be engaged and confronted on the substance. But they do need to be engaged and confronted on the substance, not run around or swept aside as if the people holding those points of view simply don't matter. They do matter, because we still have to live with each other tomorrow. And so that's the issue I take with these reactions and the instinct to try and excommunicate certain people from the dialogue, because at the end of the day, that's not how we build a community that can last. That's really no way to build a community at all.
Monica, I get the sense that you are plugged in to some degree with progressive communities in Seattle and online. How do you see their argument taking shape? And then from that, how do you see how we might be able to move forward and maybe reach a shared understanding on this issue, which has become so seemingly mutually exclusive?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing for me because I am in the journalism community, and to answer your first question, I know that the staff at the New York Times, one of the ways in which they voiced their criticism of the column being published was by saying that Black staffers at the New York Times, that their lives were put in danger by the column, because the column called for, militarization to control the protests. And boy, oh boy, is that a difficult thing to argue against, right? It's a difficult thing to say, no, you don't worry, you're safe, everything's fine. We need to talk about these things. So that's at least one of the places, I think, where the progressive argument, justifying what happened, begins and kind of stays in this place of lives come first. And if this is putting lives in danger, then how can we continue to talk about this? This was a mistake. This put lives in danger. It's good that the New York Times said so. It's good that the opinion editor left. So from that frame, you can see that outcome. And that frame also makes it really hard to put any other frame on. Because when something becomes about lives, any other frame makes it sound like you don't care about lives. I mean, so now here's where I come from. I've been spending a lot of time lately reading not just the New York Times, but FoxNews.com and Drudge Report and the Daily Caller. And I'm trying to very much diversify my diet of media, knowing that it is extremely rare for anyone to do so. But because I want to be curious, I'm curious and I want to know how people are thinking. When I saw that the cotton, op-ed in the New York Times, I think the first time I didn't even click on it, I just sort of saw the headline. But I remember thinking, and then maybe I did click on it, I remember thinking, wow, I'm really surprised. But not by the content. I was surprised that, oh, this is what like a bunch of folks on conservative media, this is the frame of mind they come with, not about necessarily militarizing, protests, but that op-ed spoke from a state of mind that I see reflected in many conservative media, which is these protests are very violent and they're scaring me, right? Like people feel scared. They're afraid about businesses being looted. They're afraid. Not to speak for the moment of what they might feel about the cause, but there are, like, if you can consider each sort of different news website as its own kind of country, almost its own community, there are communities where people see the protests very differently than the community of the New York Times. And so I was surprised because here was something from a different reality, a completely different narrative appearing in the New York Times. I was like, wow. And I'll be honest, it was refreshing to me. It was refreshing to me because it is slowly, the probability that you will see that is like reaching zero anywhere, that you will see something from a very completely different reality, usually on the partisan line, because that's the diversity we don't like. You know what I mean? That's the diversity we do not like. So the piece about, Ciaran, you asked about boundaries. There's this conception of this called Hallan spheres that I love, which is that there's this middle circle called consensus, right? Like everything in here is all consensus. Then there's this sort of thick ring called the sphere of legitimate discourse, right? And then everything outside of the sphere of legitimate discourse is deviant. So what we saw here is that the New York Times institutional leadership believed that Cotton's perspective was within the sphere of legitimate discourse. But the New York Times staffers who revolted against it, not to mention many readers, by the way, did not believe that it was in the sphere of legitimate discourse. They believed it was deviant, and in a harmful way, in a way that put lives in danger. Wow, So, does the Fox News world and its set of spheres believe that? No, right? Does the Drudge Report or does the whoever, I don't know. So when y'all say that the New York Times is the paper of record, that's almost the thing I want to push back against the most, because I believe that a lot of journalists today believe things about the penetration of mainstream media that are just not true. There's a lot of people in this country that don't consider the New York Times to be their paper of record. Not even close. But I will echo April that it is the ultimate, it is sad to me that we have no spaces that will, in fact, probably the only space where I see a diversity of thought is my computer screen, because I can load one website and then I can load another one. My computer screen is somehow witness to all of them, but good luck getting one audience anymore to consider across divides and approach different perspectives curiously before they get the signal that they should attack.
Wow, I think that's very well stated. And I think you did a good job of acknowledging and validating the concerns that were voiced, but also trying to take things to a higher level where we can step back And I think that, what was the name of the theory with the circles that you mentioned?
Hallin spheres, Hallin, Hallin spheres. It's a nice framework.
Yes, I like it. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. We've been talking for a while, and I think I could talk to you guys for another few hours, maybe even over a bottle of wine at some point, but we will leave that to a future podcast. So thank you, April. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, John and Abstentia. And thank you, Mike, for running the boards. And we will be back with you soon. Please let us know what your thoughts on this issue are. What do you think about defund the police? What do you think about the New York Times decision to walk back the Cotton op-ed? And how do you think that we might be able to make some lemonade from all of these lemons? Peace.